Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Upanishads. The term Upanishad means to sit near, and it's a term covering a body of literature that spans a period from about the 8th century BC to maybe the 4th century CE. The height of this literature is from the 8th century BC to about the 2nd century BC. But it continues being written till about the 4th or 5th century CE. And some people would argue that there are Upanishads still being written. So there is a straggling end, which maybe there is no end as yet. We recognize these texts as Upanishad due to their language, a certain vocabulary they use, a certain style they use, certain ideas that they put forward, and by their name, which implies a oral culture. Upanishad means a kind of literature arising out of intimate discourse of students and teacher, particularly in hermitages in ancient India. To talk about Upanishad, one also has to speak about the transition from the earlier body of wisdom texts, which are the Veda, to this body known as the Upanishad. And the Veda is the earliest body of texts in India, and by about the 8th century BC, we may surmise that the symbolic language of the Veda, which had translated into social forms, had become stagnant to some extent. It had also become hierarchical, and there were certain power relations that had become established due to the collusion between priests and royalty that caused a dilution of the kind of wisdom teaching of the Veda. So one may surmise that this caused some people to break away from the polis, from the social setup, and create a new kind of environment and a new kind of language in which individuals could have unmediated access to the truth. This is the basis of the Upanishad. One might think that this would occur at the edges of the social environment, habitus, and one would be right, because Upanishad would actually be the kind of text that is written or is spoken. These texts are originally spoken in hermitages at the edge of the city. So we can think about what is the relationship between Upanishad and Veda in terms of the language, in terms of the ideas, and in terms of the attitude. As I said, one might surmise again that the attitude of the Upanishad towards the Veda would be one of a kind of a distance. There would be a sense of a critical component in the relationship between the Upanishad and the Veda. This indeed is true. The Upanishad holds a critical attitude towards certain aspects of the Veda. For example, rituals, the Vedic gods, the sense of a polytheism that is part of the symbolic structure of the Veda. These things are replaced by a different idea of reality. We find that with the critical attitude towards ritual, there is also a devaluing of the kind of priesthood of the Brahmins that mediated between normal people and the divine. So now there is the notion of a unmediated access towards the divine. The Upanishad creates its own kind of language to voice its ideas. And we find words that sometimes did not appear in the Veda now gaining great prominence. The one term that is the most important term that runs through the Upanishad is Brahman. And Brahman is a term that codes for conscious being. Conscious being is infinite, and it is all that there is, and it is all that cannot even be imagined. Everything that one can experience, one can imagine, even if it is not experienced, and everything that cannot be imagined is the radical infinity that covers for the scope of Brahman. We may look at the Vedic corpus and see the difference between the Supreme as the solar deity in the Veda, replaced now by a kind of infinite reality that doesn't necessarily have a center. There isn't a clear enunciation of some kind of a central deity around whom all the other deities are constellated, or whose aspects the other deities are. On the other hand, we do have a sense of the one reality that occupies two kinds of zones, as we saw in the Veda. In the Veda, we saw the difference between a heliocentric and a geocentric zone. The heliocentric zone being the zone of everlasting day, and the geocentric being that of the alternations of days and nights, births and deaths, and a variety of other processes of duality. Now we find a similar kind of division in the Upanishad, except that they name it in more philosophic terms as Vidya and Avidya, and sometimes Para and Apara Vidya. The term Vidya literally means knowledge, and the term Avidya is the negative of knowledge, hence translated ignorance. The idea of knowledge in the Upanishad is not that of inference. The idea of knowledge has to do with knowledge by identity. One knows because one is. True knowing can only come by self-evidence, by being what one claims to know. And if one tries to know by a kind of inferential process, as we usually do, using our empirical methods and our intelligence, our mind, to arrive at a picture of reality, that would be considered ignorance. And so these are the two zones, and one can see how the heliocentric and the geocentric zones of the Veda move from their symbolic enunciation to this kind of a philosophic and epistemological enunciation in the Upanishad. The other important thing that one notes is that the gods are sometimes, rarely, the Vedic gods are rarely referred to, and when they're referred to, they're either referred to as subordinate to Brahman, or they're referred to in a kind of mystic way in which their functions are made part of a process of connecting with Brahman. The other really important term that one finds in the Upanishad is Atman. Atman does not appear in Veda, and Atman codes for an individualization of Brahman. So if Brahman is the infinite spread of reality, we may say that Brahman, being conscious, can concentrate itself and atomize itself, can occupy a point source, and such infinite point atoms of of Brahman would be called Atmans. So Atman is an individualization of Brahman. Atman makes it possible for us to conceive of entities and individuals that are also nothing other than the self-formulation of Brahman in an individual form. We also have to account for what causes the difference between the heliocentric and the geocentric zone in the Upanishads. What makes it possible for Vidya to coexist with Avidya as two different zones, one which is in full knowledge of itself and one in which the atomization of entities has caused a kind of separative knowledge to emerge, which we call ignorance. According to the Upanishad, the power that manages to create this kind of a self-appearance is called Maya. Now, we find that these types of ideas are not all contained in all the Upanishads. As I said earlier, the Upanishad is an oral tradition, and what we find in these texts called the Upanishad is only the tip of the iceberg. And we also find that different Upanishads heighten or emphasize different ideas among these kind of principal ideas that we find in these texts. Later, there was an attempt to codify the Upanishad. There was a text called Brahma Sutra that gives us a certain kind of compilation of the Upanishad and a kind of privileging or prioritizing of certain Upanishads as what one might call the principal Upanishads. Today we think of about 13 and sometimes 10 principal Upanishads, and we find that the major ideas of the Upanishads are carried in these in a scattered way. What are these 10 principal Upanishads? The earliest Upanishads, which may be thought of as emerging out of the Veda or out of Vedic literature around 1200 BC, are the Aranyakas. So the two earliest Upanishads are compilations called the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad and the Chandogya Upanishad. These are sprawling prose texts, but they already contain the ideas of Atman and Brahman and some of the other notions, such as approaches towards the division between Vidya and Avidya. Later Upanishads that arise with really important ideas are the Taittiriya and the Aitareya Upanishad, the Isha Upanishad, the Kena Upanishad, the Katha Upanishad, the Mundaka and the Mandukya Upanishads, and the Shvetashvatara Upanishad. There are certain other ones as well, like the Prashna Upanishad, for example, which is considered an important one of the major Upanishads. Now, these Upanishads contain ideas, as I said, that are in some states specialized. As we move in time, we start finding that the Upanishads move from being prose texts to becoming more crystallized, lapidary, written texts. Texts, or if not written texts, at least texts that have a poetic structure. So the early Upanishads are longer and more prose-like, and some of the Upanishads, as we move in time, become extremely concise. So we find, for example, the idea of Vidya and Avidya most prominently talked about in the Isha Upanishad. We find, for example, Brahman as the supreme deity in comparison with Vedic deities talked about most prominently in the Kena Upanishad. We find that the idea of Maya is foregrounded only really in one major Upanishad, which is the Shvetashvatara Upanishad. We find the idea of theism also emerging in some of these Upanishads, like the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, which is all about the great god Shiva. Now, these ideas are collated later and given this kind of larger sense of a body of ideas. This happens due to great teachers like Shankara and Ramanuja, who are interpreting these texts to give us a coherent understanding of what these texts contain as ideas. And in more recent times, we have Sri Aurobindo, who has given us extensive commentaries on some of these Upanishads, particularly on the Isha Upanishad and to some extent on the Kena Upanishad. One may ask the question, what are the methods, if any, that these Upanishads are proposing in terms of unmediated access towards reality, towards Brahman? The central method of the Upanishad is one of meditation. And this is contained in a pithy formula in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which talks of 3 stages of meditation. The 3 stages of meditation given in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad are Shravana, Manana, and Nididhyasana. Being an oral tradition, the first stage, Shravana, means hearing. So the texts, the Upanishad themselves, just listening to them being recited or listening to them as discourse from the teacher is the first stage of meditation. One allows the word to enter. This also implies another very important aspect of the Upanishad, that is the idea of the crystallization of words into mantra. So mantra, and the primary mantra being the sound syllable Om, is privileged in the Upanishad. We find that that is another element that is consistent in binding the Upanishad as literature. One of its principal methods is the use of the mantra Om. Om becomes a seed syllable that gives one experience of Brahman. And there is an entire Upanishad connected with the Om, which is the Mandukya Upanishad. It's important to note that in the Upanishad, there is still the notion of a marriage between idea and vibration, or between thought and will. And this one can see in very early Upanishad, like the Chandogya Upanishad, which talks in a derogatory fashion about people who just repeat mantras without really understanding what they mean. So the Upanishad makes a important kind of point about really engaging one's mind in the formulae. And that brings us to the second term of the 3-term formula, which is manana. Manana means cogitation. Manana means engaging the mind. And so whether it is a seed syllable like Om, whether it is an entire Upanishad, whether it is the voice of the teacher, or whether it is pithy sayings called Mahavakyas that one comes across in the Upanishads, these are not only to be heard, but they are also to be meditated or cogitated upon. As one reflects upon these terms, they become one's preoccupation. One casts one's mind into constant engagement with these ideas. And it is said that at a certain point they become the fabric of one's reality, and the experience that they hold becomes one's experience. This is the 3rd stage, or Nididhyasana, which really means absorption. One is absorbed in the idea so that non-duality is experienced between one and the idea that is behind the words, either of the sound syllable or of the idea of the Upanishad. Finally, I'd like to mention about the Mahavakyas. The Mahavakyas are a way by which the meaning of the Upanishad is condensed into certain singular ideas. These ideas are like crystals that one can hone in and one can repeat in one's mind like mnemonic devices. And there are some really important such formulae that the Upanishads repeat. They are called Mahavakyas. Some of the Mahavakyas are Sarvam Khaluvidam Brahma, which means all this is nothing but the Brahman. Reality, whatever we encounter, is one thing. It is the one conscious being, Brahman. So one would meditate on this. Another one is Tat Tvam Asi, which means thou art that. And that refers to meditating on the fact that whatever one encounters as the other is nothing other than the one thing that there is, which is Brahman. The third really important one is Aham Brahmasmi, which means I am the Brahman. And there are some correlates of this like Soham, which means Sa, which is he or that, is me, is I. That has become the individual, the first person. I am Atma Brahma. This Atman is nothing but Brahman. Atman and Brahman are one. These kind of formulae are called Mahavakyas, and meditating on them becomes one of the principal methods of the Upanishad. One other kind of idea that the Upanishad propose has to do with breath. And this may well be the idea that the Upanishadic culture derives from the forest yogis who were practicing a shramanic, or what in Siberia are called shamanic kinds of practices of the breath. And so breath and breathing practices become one of the principal methods of the Upanishad. Finally, one last important method which relates to cogitation is that of paradox. Some of the Upanishad, particularly the later ones, are couched in a kind of paradoxical language because reality is a appearance, but what behind the appearance, there is a paradoxical truth. So to be able to hone in on that and to meditate on that paradox until the aporia that it implies flashes as an experience that is greater than thought, is one of the really important methods of some of the later Upanishad, particularly the Isha Upanishad. One may surmise that these are the kind of ideas that later travel into schools like Zen Buddhism or Chan Buddhism in China. So these are the kinds of methods that are followed by the Upanishad. And finally, one last method that I would like to mention is the apophatic method, which is fielded in the Brihadaranyaka early Upanishad itself, that has to do with reduction. Whatever one thinks is reality, one receives from outside to be reality, can be negated so that one can go further beyond in finding something that cannot be talked about, a kind of negative theology. So all these kind of ideas, these methods of the mind are privileged by the Upanishad in its attempt to give unmediated access to the truth.